Navy brig in South Carolina and is now serving a 17-year sentence. In a court filing, the Obama administration says federal laws prevent damage claims against lawyers who advise the president on national security. And in Massachusetts, State Attorney General Martha Coakley has won the Democratic nomination to run for the late Edward Kennedy Senate seat. Coakley will square off against the Republican nominee, State Senator Scott Brown, in a special election next month. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting live from Copenhagen. This is Climate Countdown.
Time is up. Over the next 2 weeks, governments have to deliver a strong and long-term response to the challenge of climate change.
All those countries are suffering to the point that we can't see the end of it, because the mistakes other countries are making, for the mistakes that many people don't try to redeem themselves from. And
this is Climate Countdown. We're broadcasting live from Copenhagen. I'm Amy Goodman, joined by Democracy Now!'s Anjali Kamat.
Welcome, everyone. We're here in the Bella Center in Copenhagen. The UN talks here are in disarray after developing countries reacted furiously to leaked documents that show world leaders next week will be asked to sign an agreement that hands more power to rich countries and sidelines the UN in all future climate change negotiations. The secret draft agreement was leaked to the Guardian newspaper, which broke the story yesterday afternoon. The document also sets unequal limits on per capita carbon emissions for developed and developing countries in 2050, meaning that people in rich countries would be permitted to emit nearly twice as much as those in poor countries. The Guardian reports the document, known as the Danish text, was worked on by a group of individuals known as the Circle of Commitment. It is understood to include Britain, the United States, and Denmark, and has only been shown to a handful of countries since it was finalized this week. The head of the UN climate talks, Ivo de Boer, downplayed the significance of the leaked document, saying, quote, "This was an informal paper ahead of the conference given to a number of people for the purposes of consultations. The only formal texts in the UN process are the ones tabled by the chairs of this Copenhagen conference at the behest of the parties." Moments before we went on the air, Lumumba Stanislaus Di-Aping addressed the controversy. He is the Sudanese chair of the group of 132 developing countries known as G77 in China.
Is that this text, the Danish text, is an extremely dangerous document for developing countries. It is a total violation of the principles of transparency and openness. It is a rejection of the fact that the UNFCCC is the only legitimate forum for conducting negotiations by parties to the convention. And in terms of substance, it is a fundamental rejection and reworking of the UNFCCC balance of obligations between developing and developed countries. Not only that, it's our humble view, it's equally an insult to the elected president of COP15. This text comes from the office of the Prime Minister of Denmark. Its overreaching strategic goal is to destroy the balance of obligations between developing and developed industrialized Western countries. And this is done by and with a zealous rejection of the notion of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And further, it denies the fact that developed countries have a historical responsibility for damaging the atmospheric space, which is something started and has been continuing for the last over the last 200 years.
Lumumba Stanislaus Di-Aping addressing the controversy of the so-called Danish text. We're joined here in Copenhagen at the Bella Center by two people. Martin Kors is Executive Director of the South Center, journalist. Also, Naomi Klein, author of The Shock Doctrine. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! You've been watching this carefully. We're going to go back to the Sudanese delegate responding to this so-called secret Danish text. Martin Kors, explain further.
I think we all have been told that there is no plan B for Copenhagen and that we have to work very hard, on the documents on the table. So the fact that we have this 10-page document shows that they have been working on a plan B. And most of the developing countries that I have spoken to do not know at all about this text. So they feel shortchanged in that they had no say, they were not invited to contribute to a text that may be parachuted down on them later on this week by the ministers or by the presidents, and they would not have had enough time to look at it. So the process is what is bothering many, but also the substance, because the text calls for a 50% cut in global emissions by 2050, and it says that the developed countries are willing to cut by 80%. So my calculations show that if this is being proposed, the developing countries would have to cut their emissions by at least 60% per capita, or about the same as the developed countries, and that will bring their per capita emissions of greenhouse gases to about 2 tons per person by 2050, whereas a country like the United States, which now has 20 tons per capita, would go down to about 4 tons. So this means that the US would still be able to have double the per capita emissions that poor developing countries have in 2050, when the United States is so superior in terms of income, in technology, and they have contributed so much, to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this is what is outraging the developing countries.
And Martin, what do you think developing countries are going to do? Do you suspect that there'll be a walkout? What is the next step?
I don't think there will be a walkout, but they would now, I think, in fact, they should now come out with their own text, to say that this is our position on what we see as the Copenhagen decision, and not something that somebody else is putting for us. I think the other major issue for the developing countries is that this text implies the closure of the Kyoto Protocol. And that's something that all the developing countries are united against, because the Kyoto Protocol is the legally binding international agreement. The only country not in it is the United States.
Naomi Klein, let's go on from what Martin Kors is saying. The issue of the Kyoto Protocol in the United States, it's always talking about it sunsets, it ends in 2012. But that's not true.
It's one of the great misconceptions, and I actually didn't fully understand it until Martin explained it to me, so he probably can explain it much better than I can, but there is no expiration date on the Kyoto Protocol. What it had was a first period of emissions cuts that ends in 2012, and the idea was that countries would come back together and increase their emission cuts and develop the agreement. But the idea that it just needs to be scrapped completely and replaced with a wholly new deal, and that in addition to this, there isn't time to come up with a whole new deal, which is the position of the U.S. negotiators here, is based on this faulty premise that the Kyoto Protocol expires. But I think, the real issue here is what they want to replace the Kyoto Protocol with is much weaker than the Kyoto Protocol. They want to, the Kyoto Protocol comes up with a goal for all the countries that they have to reach in terms of emissions cuts, and it's legally binding. Here, what they want to replace it to is all countries go off, come up with their own goals, and then it's sort of mashed together into an agreement that really isn't a multilateral agreement, because the whole idea of multilateralism is that countries agree on the same set of rules, and they agree to a common monitoring mechanism. So the great irony of what's happening here in Copenhagen is that it takes place in this context of this huge global celebration of the U.S. re-embrace of multilateralism. in fact, Obama is getting the Nobel Prize specifically for this. In the citation for the Nobel Prize, they talk about the re-engagement with the climate talks, the embrace of multilateralism. He's getting the Nobel Prize for it, but what's actually happening here is that they're using the tools of multilateralism, the infrastructure of multilateralism, to destroy multilateralism, to kill multilateralism.
We're going to break, then we're going to come back to this discussion. Naomi Klein, well-known journalist, author of The Shock Doctrine, and the 10th anniversary edition is just out of her first book, No Logo. Martin Kaur with us, Executive Director of the South Center. We're live in Copenhagen. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with them. Then we'll be joined by the chief climate change negotiators from 2 Latin American countries, from Paraguay and